When I first pulled my RV into the lot at the Timberline Trail, the only thing I worried about was the weather. A cold front had rolled in overnight, leaving the air sharp and frosty. Low clouds hung over Mount Hood, their edges brushing the towering pines like fingers. Not ideal for the sweeping drone shots I'd envisioned, but nothing I couldn't work around. This was supposed to be one of my biggest projects yet, a multi-day trek along the lesser-traveled sections of the trail, documenting the rugged beauty of Mount Hood for my YouTube channel. My followers were small in number, but growing. Timberline felt like the kind of bold, dramatic backdrop that could finally put me on the map. What I didn't realize was that Timberline had plans for me too. The first day was grueling. The trail was tougher than I'd anticipated, with steep inclines and patches of loose scree that forced me to take slow, deliberate steps. I'd misjudged the weight of my pack and the extra gear I'd brought. Tripods, lenses, and my drone felt like a lead anchor dragging me down. Around midday, I stopped at a ridge overlooking a stretch of dense forest. The view was breathtaking, rows of pine trees stretching endlessly into the distance, their green tips fading into the blue-gray mist. I set up my drone and sent it soaring into the sky, capturing sweeping footage of the ridges and valleys below. The screen on my controller showed stunning shots of the trail winding through the forest until the feed began to glitch. Static filled the screen, and then the drone lost connection. I stared at the controls, willing it to reconnect, but the GPS coordinates vanished. "Great," I muttered, stuffing the controller back into my bag. I hiked down the trail to retrieve the drone, eventually finding it lodged in a tree. One of the propellers was bent, and the footage was corrupted, filled with flickering shapes I couldn't explain. "Looks like you're done for the trip," I said, shoving the drone into my pack. That night, the sense of isolation began to set in. I parked the RV in a remote clearing off the main road. The quiet was deeper than I expected, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant hoot of an owl. As I cooked dinner on the small propane stove, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every so often, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a branch swaying or a shadow shifting, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. "You're being ridiculous," I muttered to myself, flipping through my footage from earlier. But even the photos seemed strange. The landscape shots looked fine at first glance, but when I zoomed in, I noticed subtle distortions in the shadows, shapes that shouldn't have been there. The second day brought more complications. I woke to find the RV door slightly ajar. My stomach clenched. I could have sworn I locked it before going to bed. Inside, everything seemed undisturbed, but when I checked my camera bag, I found the batteries drained. They'd been fully charged the night before. Brushing off the unease, I packed up my gear and headed out. The trail grew steeper as it climbed into the upper ridges, the air thinning with each step. By noon, a thick fog had rolled in, swallowing the landscape in a pale, featureless haze. That's when I saw the footprints. They were massive, human-like, but far too large to belong to any normal person. The impressions were deep, as if whatever made them carried significant weight. They led down the trail, disappearing into the mist. "Probably just some hiker with oversized boots," I said out loud, though the words felt hollow. The fog muffled every sound, and I started to feel the weight of the silence again. No birds, no rustling leaves, just my own footsteps and the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. And then the whispers began. At first I thought it was the wind, soft, faint noises carried through the trees. but as I listened, the whispers grew clearer, almost like voices. They weren't speaking in a language I recognized, but their tone was unmistakable, mocking. I spun around, my breath clouding in the cold air. The trail behind me was empty. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. The whispers stopped. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sky was dark, and the whispers were still echoing in my head. As I set up camp for the night, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when I stepped outside to check my surroundings, I saw them. Figures. At first, they were barely visible, tall, shadowy forms at the edge of the clearing, blending seamlessly with the trees. My flashlight caught movement, and for a moment, I thought I saw elongated limbs, impossibly thin and unnaturally long. The beam of light flickered, and when I looked again, the figures were gone. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at the RV's small table staring out the window with my flashlight and a makeshift weapon, a trekking pole I'd sharpened with my multi-tool. The forest was silent, but I could feel the weight of their presence like unseen eyes boring into my skull. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate. They circled the RV, pausing occasionally, as if whoever or whatever it was wanted me to know they were there. I gripped the trekking pole tighter, my pulse thundering in my ears. The footsteps stopped. And then the RV door handle turned. I bolted upright, holding my breath as the handle jiggled once, twice, and then fell still. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice shaking. Silence. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, there was nothing there. No tracks, no sign of movement, just the cold, empty clearing. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my gear and prepared to leave, but as I started the RV, I noticed something strange. Stacked rocks, or cairns, lined the edge of the clearing. They hadn't been there the day before. They formed a path leading into the woods away from the main trail. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The cairns led me deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser and the air colder with each step. The whispers returned, louder now, filling my head with a strange, rhythmic cadence. I reached a clearing surrounded by towering pines, and that's when I saw them again. The Watchers. They stood at the edge of the clearing, their tall, thin forms swaying slightly, as if moved by an unseen wind. Their faces were obscured, swallowed by shadow, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold, unblinking, and hungry. One of them stepped forward, its movement unnervingly smooth. It raised an elongated hand and pointed at me. I ran. The trail was gone, replaced by uneven ground and tangled roots. I stumbled, falling hard onto my knees, but I forced myself to get up. The whispers grew louder, the shadows closing in around me. When I finally saw the RV through the trees, I sprinted for it, slamming the door shut behind me. The Watchers didn't follow, but their presence lingered, a heavy, oppressive weight pressing against the walls of the RV. As I drove away, the cairns reappeared along the road, marking my path out of the forest. The whispers faded with each mile, but the memory of their voices stayed with me. When I checked my cameras later, the footage was gone. Every file had been corrupted, erased as if it had never existed. I tried writing about the experience for my channel, but the words felt hollow. No one would believe me anyway. Sometimes when I camp alone, I catch glimpses of movement at the edge of the firelight, and I wonder if the Watchers have followed me, waiting for me to return to Timberline. But I won't, not ever. When Tom and I drove our RV into Chugach National Forest, I thought I knew what I was getting into. As a wilderness guide, I'd tackled tougher trails and harsher conditions than this. The plan was simple: scout a new trail for our adventure company, find something unique to offer clients, and enjoy the solitude along the way. Easy, right? The Alaskan wilderness had other ideas. We parked it near the edge of the forest, where the towering spruce trees seemed to stretch forever, their shadows swallowing the ground even in the early afternoon. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and snow, and the distant peaks gleamed like jagged teeth against the sky. "This is it," I said, slinging my pack over my shoulder. "Pristine, untouched, exactly what we're looking for." Tom adjusted his gear and shot me a skeptical look. "Sure, because pristine always means safe, right?" "You worry too much," I said with a grin. "That's why you brought me." He muttered something under his breath, but followed me onto the narrow path that would eventually disappear into the undergrowth. It was perfect. Remote and rugged, the kind of trail our clients would love. The first day passed without much trouble. We navigated steep inclines, crossed icy streams, and marked potential campsites along the way. But by mid-afternoon, the terrain became harder to read. The trail thinned out, as if nature had reclaimed it, and a dense fog began to roll in. "I don't like this," Tom said, his voice muffled by the growing mist. "It feels wrong." "Fog's normal in these parts," I replied, though I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. "We'll stop soon." Then we found the footprints. They were human, barefoot, wide, and oddly long. They led off the trail and into the forest, disappearing into the thick brush. No sign of other hikers or campsites nearby. "Who the hell walks barefoot out here?" Tom asked, kneeling to study the tracks. "Could be old," I said, though the edges looked too fresh for my liking. "Let's keep moving." That night, the forest came alive with strange sounds. Not the usual rustle of wildlife, but something off. Echoing calls that resembled animal cries but sounded almost human. As we sat by the campfire, Tom turned to me, his face pale in the flickering light. "You hear that?" "Probably just coyotes," I said, trying to convince myself. But deep down, I wasn't sure. The wind carried a faint laugh, soft and eerie, like it was meant just for us. Tom stiffened. "That didn't sound like a coyote." I didn't have an answer. The next morning, we realized the trail had vanished. I woke to find our surroundings completely unfamiliar. The path we'd been following was gone, replaced by unbroken forest. I double-checked our map and compass, but they were no help. "We're not lost," I said, though the doubt in my voice betrayed me. "Sure feels like it," Tom muttered, scanning the dense trees. "Let's backtrack." But backtracking didn't work. Every direction led us in circles, the same set of trees appearing over and over again. By midday, my confidence had begun to crack. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered, checking the compass again. The needle spun uselessly. "Maybe it's magnetic interference," Tom suggested. "From what?" I snapped, frustration bleeding into my tone. Then I heard it, a faint voice calling my name. "Ethan!" I froze, my blood turning cold. It was Tom's voice, but he was standing right next to me. "Ethan, help me," the voice called again, this time from the direction of the trees. Tom stared at me, his eyes wide. "I didn't say anything." We pressed on, our unease growing with every step. By late afternoon, we stumbled across a small clearing where a familiar figure stood waiting. It was Nora, a local ranger we'd met briefly at the edge of the forest. She had warned us about staying on the marked trails and respecting the land. Now, she stood with her arms crossed, her expression a mix of irritation and concern. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "Didn't I warn you?" "We didn't mean to stray this far," I said, grateful for her presence despite her sharp tone. "But we've been seeing strange things." Her face darkened. "The Kushtaka." Tom frowned. "What's that?" "It's a creature from Tlangit legend," she said. "A shapeshifter. It lures people away by mimicking voices or appearing as someone familiar. Once you're lost, it feeds on your fear." I scoffed, though the pit in my stomach deepened. "With all due respect, Nora, we don't believe in folklore." She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You don't have to believe it for it to be real." Before I could respond, she pointed at a tree nearby. Its bark was carved with strange markings, elongated shapes resembling eyes. I hadn't noticed them before. "It's been watching you," she said quietly. "If you want to make it out, you need to stay grounded. Don't trust what you see. Don't follow what you hear." That night, the Kushtaka came for us. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and carrying faint whispers with it. As Tom and I huddled near the fire, I heard my father's voice, low and familiar, tinged with disappointment. "Ethan, you'll never be enough. Why do you keep running?" I clenched my fist, trying to block it out. "Don't listen to it," I told Tom. "It's not real." But then Tom stood abruptly, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. "It's my sister. She's calling me." I grabbed his arm. "Tom, stay here. It's not her." But he broke free, disappearing into the trees before I could stop him. I chased after him, the firelight fading behind me. The forest seemed to shift with every step, the trees closing in like a labyrinth. The whispers grew louder, blending with laughter and distorted cries. Finally, I saw Tom, or someone who looked like him. He was standing near a stream, his back to me. "Tom!" I shouted. He turned slowly and my stomach dropped. His face was wrong, blurred like a smudged painting with empty black pits where his eyes should have been. "You can't save him," a voice whispered behind me. I spun around and came face to face with myself. The figure mirrored my appearance perfectly, down to the scar on my chin, but its smile was cruel and predatory. "Why do you fight it?" it said, stepping closer. "You've already lost." I stumbled back, my heart pounding. Remembering Nora's warning, I pulled out my compass and map, focusing on them instead of the illusions around me. The needle steadied, and a faint trail emerged in the distance. I ran, the Kushtaka's laughter echoing behind me. I found Tom near a cliff edge, dazed and shaking. He mumbled incoherently, his eyes darting to shadows that weren't there. I grabbed him, pulling him back from the brink. "We're leaving," I said firmly, dragging him toward the faint trail. The forest fought us every step of the way, the whispers growing louder, the trees seeming to close in. But I kept my focus on the map, refusing to trust my senses. Finally, the RV came into view, a beacon of safety in the chaos. We didn't look back as we sped away, the dense forest giving way to open plains. Tom sat silently, staring at the floor, while I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white. As the miles stretched behind us, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw someone sitting in the back of the RV, a figure that looked just like me, smiling faintly. I didn't look again. When I first pulled my RV into Badlands National Park, I wasn't looking for closure. I wasn't even sure I believed in such a thing anymore. I was here for one thing: to capture the raw, untamed beauty of the Badlands for a wildlife photography competition. The fact that my late wife, Sarah, had dreamed of visiting this place felt like a strange kind of coincidence, or maybe an excuse. The desolate buttes stretched across the horizon like the bones of an ancient giant, their shadows sharp under the evening sun. I set up camp near the edge of a canyon, miles from the nearest marked trail. The isolation was intentional. I wanted to focus, to push myself beyond the memories that had clung to me like a shadow since Sarah's passing. The first night was uneventful. I spent hours tinkering with my camera, setting up motion sensors and tripods to capture nocturnal wildlife. The wind howled occasionally, but that was normal out here. The Badlands were notorious for their unpredictable weather, but as the night deepened, the wind shifted. It wasn't just noise anymore. It carried something faint, almost like crying. I stepped outside the RV, flashlight in hand, scanning the empty landscape. Nothing but the skeletal silhouettes of distant buttes. I told myself it was the wind playing tricks and went back inside. But I didn't sleep. The next day I met Avery. I was out near a ridge looking for signs of wildlife when I spotted her setting up a small tent. She looked young and carefree, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail, and waved when she saw me. "Didn't think I'd see anyone out here," she said, her voice light and cheerful. "You camping?" "RV," I replied, nodding toward the distant speck that was my campsite. "You?" "Just passing through," she said with a grin, "though this place has its quirks." "Quirks?" I asked. She hesitated, glancing at the canyon behind me. "You haven't heard about the crying wind?" I shook my head, intrigued despite myself. "Legend says it's a spirit," she explained, "a vengeful one. It feeds on guilt and regret, luring people toward the canyon's edge. Once it has you, well, you're gone." She said it casually, like recounting a campfire story, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of unease. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, trying to sound amused, but her words lingered as I returned to my RV. That night, the crying was louder. It started faint, almost imperceptible, but as the hours dragged on, it grew insistent. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside, the beam cutting through the inky darkness. The wind swirled around me, carrying the sound, low, mournful wails that seemed to echo from the canyon itself. "Nate?" I froze. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. My name. "Nate, come here." It was Sarah's voice. My chest tightened as I turned toward the canyon. The wind carried her voice again, softer this time, pleading. "Please, I need you." I took a step forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand, but as I neared the edge, a sudden gust of wind nearly knocked me off my feet. The flashlight slipped from my grip, its beam bouncing wildly before it went out. I stumbled back to the RV, my heart racing. Sleep didn't come. The next morning, I met Deputy Clark Maddox. He was inspecting the area near the ridge when I approached him. "Something wrong?" I asked. "Just routine," he said, though his furrowed brow suggested otherwise. "Had a few hikers go missing out here recently." "Missing?" I asked, my stomach tightening. He nodded. "Always near this canyon. Locals blame the crying wind, but I'm guessing they got disoriented, maybe wandered too close to the edge." I thought of the voice I'd heard last night, but said nothing. Instead, I asked, "Do you believe the stories?" The deputy hesitated, his eyes scanning the canyon. "I've worked these lands for 20 years. Let's just say there are things out here I can't explain. Best advice I can give? Don't linger too long." Later, I found the stone circle. It was a small clearing hidden among jagged rocks. The stones were arranged in a perfect circle, and at the center lay a burnt offering: sage, feathers, and something that looked like dried blood. My photographer's instinct kicked in, and I snapped a few shots, though the scene left me unsettled. When I reviewed the images back at the RV, they were distorted. A streak of shadow ran across each photo, almost like a smudge, though there was nothing wrong with my lens. Avery visited my camp that evening. She seemed tense, her usual cheer replaced by a quiet unease. "You found the circle, didn't you?" she asked, sitting by the fire. "How'd you know?" I asked. "It's a ward," she said. "Locals use it to keep the crying wind at bay. If you disturbed it, even just by being near it—" She trailed off, her expression grim. "What happens?" I pressed. She met my gaze. "You've drawn its attention." That night, the crying wind came for me. The RV rattled violently as the wind roared outside, howling like a living thing. The crying returned, louder and more anguished, blending with whispers that seeped into my thoughts. "Nate, you let me go. You couldn't save me. Come to me." I clenched my fists, trying to block out the voices, but they were relentless. When I glanced out the window, I saw her, Sarah, standing at the edge of the canyon, her hair blowing in the wind. "Sarah?" I whispered, my voice breaking. She turned toward me, her face pale and ethereal, her eyes filled with sorrow. She raised a hand, beckoning. I threw open the door and stumbled into the night, the wind tearing at my clothes. "Sarah!" I shouted, running toward the canyon. As I neared the edge, Avery's voice cut through the storm. "Nate, stop!" She grabbed my arm, yanking me back just as I teetered on the brink. I collapsed to the ground, gasping, the apparition of Sarah dissolving into mist. "You can't listen to it," Avery said, her voice urgent. "It's not her." The next morning, Avery helped me reconstruct the stone circle. She brought sage and feathers, instructing me to place something of deep personal value in the center. I hesitated before pulling out the locket Sarah had given me on our anniversary. It held a photo of us from happier times. My fingers trembled as I placed it among the offerings. We lit the sage, and the wind grew deafening, whipping around us in a furious spiral. The crying wind manifested, a swirling shadow, formless yet menacing. Its presence was suffocating, its cries a blend of anguish and rage. Avery shouted over the wind, "Face it, Nate! Let go of the guilt!" The shadow loomed closer, its cries piercing. My mind flooded with memories of Sarah, her laugh, her touch, the day I lost her. I clenched my fist, forcing myself to speak. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shaking. "I couldn't save you, but I can't follow you." The wind roared, the shadow writhing as if in pain. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence. I left the Badlands the next day, the locket still lying in the circle. I felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of Sarah's loss had loosened its grip on me. The photos I'd taken captured the haunting beauty of the landscape, but they also carried a reminder of what I'd faced. As I drove away, the wind brushed against the RV, soft and gentle. For the first time, it sounded like a farewell. There's a reason I prefer solo trips. No distractions, no expectations, just me, my camera, and the wilderness. Olympic National Park was my next destination, a place I'd always wanted to capture. The vibrant greens of its moss-covered trees and the misty shrouds of its hidden corners promised the perfect backdrop for my latest project, a nature calendar for a high-profile client. When I parked my RV at a remote trailhead, the forest was alive with the sounds of nature. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the air smelled of pine and rain-soaked earth. I stretched, taking it all in, savoring the solitude. I didn't know then how oppressive that solitude would become. The first day started as planned. I hiked well-marked trails, photographing ancient trees and sunlit glades. But near midday, as I stopped at a rocky overlook to eat, I overheard a group of hikers talking nearby. "Have you heard about the lake?" one of them asked. "The one that doesn't ripple?" Another hiker chuckled nervously. "You mean the ghost lake?" "Yeah, no thanks. That place is cursed." The first hiker shrugged. "Some say it's cursed. Others say it's just weird, like a perfect mirror. But it's not on the maps. You have to find it." The conversation piqued my curiosity. A hidden, mirror-like lake? It sounded too good to be true, ideal for the kind of unique shot my client would love. I decided I'd look for it, despite their warnings. The next day, I ventured deeper into the park, leaving the marked trails behind. The forest became denser, the undergrowth thicker, and the air heavier. My compass began to act up, spinning erratically, and my GPS lost signal. Undeterred, I pressed on. Hours later, I stumbled upon something strange. An old, cracked mirror hanging from a tree branch. Its surface was smeared with handprints, some small, others unnervingly large. I hesitated, a shiver running down my spine, but told myself it was just a random hiker's odd idea of art. Finally, I found the lake. It was breathtaking and surreal. The surface was so smooth and reflective it seemed unreal, as if the sky had descended to meet the earth. Even as a light wind brushed through the trees, the lake remained eerily still. It mirrored everything perfectly. The trees, the clouds, me. I raised my camera, thrilled at the prospect of capturing something so unique. But as I looked through the lens, something seemed off. My reflection didn't quite match my movements. I tilted my head slightly. The reflection moved a fraction of a second too late. I froze, lowering the camera. The reflection stared back, its eyes locked onto mine. A wave of unease washed over me, but I convinced myself it was my imagination. I snapped a few shots and headed back to my RV, eager to review the images. On the way, I encountered another hiker, a man in his 30s with a lean frame and intense eyes. He introduced himself as Jonah. "You're looking for the lake, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low. "I already found it," I said, curious about his sudden interest. "Why?" Jonah's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Be careful. That lake, it's not just water. It sees you." I laughed nervously. "What do you mean?" Jonah stepped closer, his expression serious. "People go to the lake and lose themselves. It shows you things, your fears, your regrets. It reflects them. And if you're not careful, it takes more than your reflection." A chill crept up my spine. His words echoed the hiker's warnings, but I shrugged it off. "Thanks for the advice. I'll keep that in mind." Jonah nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he turned and disappeared into the trees. That night, the whispers began. I was sitting in my RV, reviewing the day's photos, when I heard it. A faint voice calling my name. "Nate!" I froze, my heart pounding. The sound came from outside, soft but unmistakable. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, scanning the darkness. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was nothing there. "Nate!" The voice came again, louder this time. It sounded like me. I slammed the door shut and locked it. Sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I returned to the lake. Despite the previous night's unsettling experience, I was determined to finish my shoot. But as I approached the lake, I noticed something chilling. My reflection was already there. It stood perfectly still, staring at me, even as I remained hidden behind the trees. My breath caught, and I stepped closer. The reflection moved now, matching my steps, but its eyes remained fixed on mine, unblinking. "What do you want?" I whispered, though I didn't expect an answer. The reflection's lips moved, but I heard no sound. Instead, the whispers began again, soft and insistent, coming from all directions. "Come closer. See the truth." I backed away, heart racing, and turned to leave, only to find Jonah standing behind me. "Don't look at it for too long," he said, his voice calm. "That's how it gets you." "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaking. Jonah hesitated, his gaze shifting to the lake. "Something old. Something that's been here longer than we can imagine. It takes pieces of people, bits of their soul, their identity. If you let it, it'll take everything." Jonah's warning lingered as I returned to my RV. That night, I heard whispers again, louder and more persistent. They didn't just call my name. They spoke of my failures, my regrets, my insecurities. "You're not good enough. She left because you're broken. You'll never be whole." The words clawed at my mind, dredging up memories I'd buried. I covered my ears, but the whispers came from inside my head. I glanced out the window and saw my reflection standing by the lake, staring at me. Its lips moved in time with the whispers. I slammed the blinds shut and huddled in the corner, my heart racing. By morning, I was unraveling. My compass was useless, my GPS still dead, and the trails seemed to twist back on themselves. No matter which direction I walked, I ended up back at the lake. In desperation, I turned to Jonah, who seemed unfazed by the forest's strange behavior. "It's the lake," he said simply. "It wants you to give in, to see." "What does it want me to see?" I demanded. "Yourself," he said, his voice grim. "All the parts you hide, all the things you fear, it wants to consume you." That evening, Jonah lured me back to the lake. He claimed he'd found a way to break the lake's hold, but as we reached the water's edge, I realized something was wrong. Jonah's reflection wasn't in the lake. "You're not real," I whispered, stepping back. Jonah smiled, but it was cold and alien. "I'm as real as you let me be." The lake rippled for the first time, and my reflection emerged from the water, walking toward me. It looked like me, but with hollow eyes and a cruel smile. "You don't belong here," it said, its voice layered with mine. "Leave, or stay forever." In a surge of panic, I remembered the mirror I'd found earlier. I grabbed it from my pack and held it up, angling its cracked surface toward the lake. My reflection screamed, its form flickering and distorting. The whispers rose to a deafening roar before abruptly cutting off. The forest fell silent. The lake was still again, its surface smooth and perfect. Jonah was gone, as was my reflection. I stumbled back to my RV and drove until the forest was far behind me. But as I reviewed my photos later, I found something chilling. In every shot of the lake, a figure stood in the distance looking exactly like me. Some reflections should never be chased. The silence was what struck me first. Redwood National and state parks were supposed to hum with life. The rustle of leaves, the chatter of birds, the distant rush of water. But as I parked my RV in a secluded campground deep in the forest, the world seemed unnervingly still. I'd come here for inspiration, a way to kickstart my struggling travel blog. My last few posts had flopped, and I could practically feel the weight of my followers' indifference. This trip was supposed to change that. A solo adventure, a raw, unfiltered account of the towering redwoods and their ancient mysteries. But standing alone in the clearing, surrounded by those impossibly tall trees, I felt a flicker of unease. The shadows between the trunks seemed too dark, too deep. I shook it off. "You're being ridiculous," I muttered, grabbing my pack. The first day was uneventful. I hiked a well-worn trail, taking photos of sunbeams, filtering through the canopy and scribbling notes about the forest's serene majesty. The air smelled of moss and earth, and for a while I felt the tension in my chest ease. It wasn't until I veered off the trail that things began to change. I'd read about an unmarked path that led to a hidden grove, a perfect spot for the kind of exclusive content my blog needed. The trail was faint, almost invisible, but I found it, winding between the trees. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. The sound of my boots crunching on the dirt seemed too loud, echoing strangely in the stillness. I told myself it was just the isolation, but a prickle of unease crept up my spine, and then I saw it. At first I thought it was my shadow, cast long by the afternoon sun. But as I moved, it didn't. It stayed still, a dark figure between the trees, shaped like a man, like me. My breath caught as I stared at it, my heart pounding. Then it was gone, swallowed by the shadows. Back at the RV that evening, I tried to write about the day, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't shake the image of that figure. Its unmoving silhouette burned into my mind. "You're imagining things," I told myself. "It's just your nerves." To distract myself, I made a simple dinner and poured a glass of wine. The RV's small table felt comforting, a reminder of the world outside this strange, silent forest. But as I reached for my notebook, I froze. My camera, which I'd left by the door, was now sitting on the counter. I stared at it, trying to remember if I'd moved it. Maybe I had. Maybe I'd been distracted. But as I picked it up, a chill ran through me. The lens was smudged, as if someone had touched it. That night, the dreams came. I was walking the unmarked trail again, the forest pressing in on me. Shadows shifted in the corners of my vision, and every time I turned I saw it, the figure standing just beyond the trees. But in the dream, it wasn't still. It moved. It walked like me, its head tilting at the same angle, its hands mimicking my every gesture. When I spoke, it spoke. When I stopped, it stopped. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the dream. It smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far, and pointed at me. I woke, drenched in sweat, the RV's interior pitch black. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fumbled for the flashlight. The beam swept across the small space, revealing nothing out of place. But when I turned it toward the window, my stomach dropped. A face stared back at me from the glass. My face. The next morning, I told myself it had been a nightmare. Exhaustion, stress, too much wine. It had to be. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The ground around the RV was marked with footprints. My footprints. They circled the vehicle over and over, as if I'd been pacing all night. "Get a grip, Ethan," I muttered, grabbing my pack. I needed to do something, anything to distract myself. I decided to head back to the unmarked trail. The forest seemed different now, the air heavier, the light dimmer even in the morning. The unease from the day before clung to me like a second skin. As I followed the faint path, I noticed something strange. Landmarks I'd passed yesterday, a fallen log, a jagged boulder, were in different places. It was as if the forest had shifted overnight, rearranging itself. And then I saw it again. The figure stood farther down the trail, its back to me. My breath caught as I watched it, my mind racing. It looked exactly like me. Same clothes, same build, even the same pack slung over its shoulder. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice shaken. "Who are you?" It didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward, disappearing behind a tree. I ran to where it had been, but there was nothing there. The trail was empty. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling. Something was wrong with this place. I could feel it in my bones. That night, the noises started. At first, it was a faint rustling like leaves stirring in the wind. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the RV. I sat frozen in the bunk, clutching the flashlight, my pulse racing. The footsteps stopped by the door. "Ethan," a voice whispered. My name. Spoken softly, almost tenderly, but unmistakably my own voice. I bit back a scream as the handle jiggled, once, twice, before falling still. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I didn't move until dawn. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed hurriedly, my hands shaking as I shoved clothes and gear into bags. But as I started the engine, the RV shuddered and died. I tried again. Nothing. Panic bubbled in my chest as I stepped outside. The figure was waiting. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. For the first time, I saw its face clearly. It was mine, every detail, down to the faint scar on my left cheek. But its eyes were empty, dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. "What do you want?" I shouted. It didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed at me. "No," I said, backing toward the RV. "You're not real. You're not me." It smiled, that terrible, too wide smile, and stepped forward. The forest darkened around it, the shadows stretching toward me like claws. I ran. The forest closed in around me, the trees blurring together as I sprinted down the trail. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. No matter how far I went, the figure was always there, just at the edge of my vision. Trails looped back on themselves and landmarks shifted, leaving me disoriented and lost. I stumbled into a clearing, collapsing to my knees. The figure stepped out of the trees, its movements slow and deliberate. "You're not real," I said again, my voice trembling. It crouched in front of me, its empty eyes locking onto mine. "Are you sure?" it asked, its voice a perfect echo of my own. I froze, my mind spinning. Doubt crept in, cold and insidious. What if it was right? What if I wasn't the real Ethan? What if— "No!" I screamed, slamming my fists into the ground. "You're lying!" The figure tilted its head as if considering me. Then, slowly, it stood and backed away, fading into the shadows. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV. The engine roared to life on the first try, and I sped down the forest road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I finally reached the highway, I pulled over, my body trembling with exhaustion. As I stared into the rearview mirror, my reflection stared back. For a moment, I thought I saw it smile, a wide, unnatural grin, but when I blinked, it was gone. I don't know what I saw in that forest, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps outside my door and wonder if it's still following me. Curiosity has always been my fatal flaw. It's why I became an engineer, why I spent hours tinkering with broken appliances as a kid, and why I'd driven my RV deep into Lost Pine Woods, following a breadcrumb trail of cryptic forum posts and vague rumors about the Clockwork men. I told myself this trip was about rekindling my creative spark, finding inspiration after months of career limbo. But the truth was simpler. I couldn't resist the mystery. An abandoned watchmaker's cabin, strange machines in the forest, and whispers of things that weren't quite human. It was the kind of story that begged to be solved. The woods were denser than I'd expected, the towering pines blotting out the sky and turning the air cold. I parked my RV in a clearing just off an old logging road and set out on foot, my pack heavy with water, snacks, and gear. The trail was barely a trail, just a faint path winding between trees. I marked my way with ribbons of bright orange tape, tying them to branches every 50 feet. The last thing I wanted was to get lost out here. The first strange thing I noticed was the silence. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just the soft crunch of my boots on the forest floor. It felt like stepping into a vacuum. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, just on the edge of hearing. A soft, rhythmic ticking, like a watch buried deep in someone's pocket. I paused, straining to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Shaking off the unease, I pressed on. It was late afternoon when I found the first sign of the watchmaker. A rusted pocket watch lay half buried in the dirt, its cover etched with intricate floral designs. When I picked it up, I realized the hands were moving backward, the ticking steady but wrong. I should have left it there. Instead, I slipped it into my pocket and kept walking. The cabin appeared just as the sun dipped below the treetops, its silhouette emerging from the shadows like something conjured. It was small, weathered, and overgrown with ivy, its windows broken and its roof sagging. Inside, the air smelled of oil and rust. Dust motes floated in the dim light filtering through the cracked windows. The walls were lined with shelves, each one cluttered with strange, half-finished machines. Metal birds with gears for wings, a mechanical cat frozen mid-leap, a clock shaped like a tree, its branches ticking in slow, deliberate movements. In the center of the room stood the most elaborate creation of all, a massive machine, its purpose unknowable. It looked like an oversized clock face mounted on a steel frame, its hands spinning in erratic patterns. Gears and pistons jutted from its base, connected by a maze of wires. As I moved closer, the ticking grew louder. That's when I saw the first figure. It was standing in the corner, its metallic body catching the faint light. Humanoid in shape, but impossibly tall and thin, with spindly limbs and exposed gears where muscles should have been. Its head tilted slightly, and I realized its glass eyes were fixed on me. I froze, my heart pounding. For a moment, I thought it was just another machine, motionless and inert, but then its hand twitched. The ticking around me seemed to sync with its movements as it stepped forward, its joints creaking faintly. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. The forest was darker than before, the shadows thicker, the ticking following me no matter how far I ran. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes on me, the sense that I wasn't just being followed, I was being herded. Twice, I stumbled over roots and rocks, scraping my palms as I scrambled back to my feet. My compass was useless, its needle spinning wildly, and the orange ribbons I'd tied to the trees were nowhere to be found. That's when I saw the second figure. This one was farther away, standing between two trees. Its elongated form swayed slightly, its glass eyes catching the moonlight. I veered off the trail, plunging into the underbrush. The ticking grew louder, joined by faint metallic clicks and whirs. When I finally found my way back to the cabin, I wasn't sure if I was relieved or terrified. The door creaked open as I stepped inside, my flashlight beam sweeping across the room. The central machine was still ticking, its gears turning steadily. But something was different. The smaller machines on the shelves had started to move. The metal bird flapped its wings, the mechanical cat arched its back, and the tree clock's branches swayed in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. "Leave." The voice was mechanical, hollow, and it came from the figure in the corner. I spun around to see one of the Clockwork men standing by the doorway, its glass eyes glowing faintly. "Leave," it said again, its voice echoing unnaturally. I backed toward the central machine, my mind racing. If this thing was controlling them, if the ticking was their heartbeat, then maybe I could stop it. The machine was more complex than anything I'd ever seen, its inner workings a chaotic tangle of gears, wires, and springs. My hands shook as I searched for a way to disable it. The first Clockwork man took a step forward, its movements jerky but precise. Behind it, another figure appeared, then another, their glass eyes locking onto me. The ticking grew deafening. Desperate, I grabbed a heavy wrench from the workbench and swung it at the machine. Sparks flew as the wrench connected with the gears, jamming them in place. The ticking stuttered, and the Clockwork men froze mid-step. For a moment, everything was silent, and then the machine roared to life. The cabin shook as the central machine's gears spun wildly, the clock face shattering as steam hissed from its base. The Clockwork men began moving again, faster this time, their limbs jerking erratically. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted for the door, ducking past the first Clockwork man as it swiped at me with a clawed hand. The forest was a blur of shadows and branches as I ran, the ticking echoing in my ears. The figures followed, their glass eyes glowing like fireflies in the dark. When I finally saw the faint outline of my RV through the trees, relief washed over me. I sprinted the last few yards, throwing myself inside and locking the door behind me. The ticking stopped. For a long moment I sat on the floor, my chest heaving as I listened to the silence outside. When I finally peeked through the window, the forest was empty. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally started the engine and drove away. The pocket watch I'd found earlier is still in my pack. Its hands move backward, ticking softly in the quiet. I haven't told anyone about what happened. The photos I took at the cabin were corrupted, the images blurred and distorted. But sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I hear it again. That faint, rhythmic ticking, always just on the edge of hearing. And I wonder if the Clockwork men are still watching. The Great Smoky Mountains were everything I'd hoped they'd be, sprawling, lush, and untouched. It had taken months of planning, but I was finally here, parked at the edge of a remote clearing deep in the park. The RV was a comforting presence behind me as I stared out at the dense forest. Somewhere out there was the ghost orchid, a rare, almost mythical flower that had eluded botanists for decades. Finding it would be the culmination of years of work, and maybe a way to honor Laura's memory. "Dad, this place is creepy," Sophia said, tugging at my sleeve. My 10-year-old daughter stood beside me, her wide eyes scanning the towering trees. "Why does it feel so quiet?" "It's nature," I said, forcing a smile. "Sometimes it's peaceful. Sometimes it's too quiet," she mumbled, crossing her arms. "I don't like it." She had a point. The forest was unnaturally silent, the usual sounds of birds and insects conspicuously absent. But I shrugged it off. I couldn't afford to let her fear derail this trip, not after how much effort it had taken to get here. "Come on," I said, picking up my pack. "We've got a lot of ground to cover today." The first day of hiking was uneventful, though the silence followed us everywhere. We marked our trail carefully, tying strips of orange fabric to branches and scratching arrows into the dirt. Sophia walked a few paces behind me, dragging her feet and occasionally kicking rocks. "Why are we even here?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "You're just looking for some dumb flower." "It's not dumb," I said, glancing back at her. "It's important. Your mom and we talked about finding it for years. This was her dream, too." Sophia frowned. "But she's gone, and I don't think she'd want you dragging me out into the middle of nowhere." Her words hit harder than I expected, but I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on the trail ahead, my mind buzzing with fragments of Laura's voice, her excitement when we'd first talked about the ghost orchid. This trip wasn't just for me. It was for her. I had to believe that. The second day was when things started to feel off. We set out early, hoping to reach a ridge where I'd read the orchid might grow. The air felt heavier as we climbed, the sunlight filtering weakly through the dense canopy. Around midday, I spotted it, a flash of white among the greenery. The ghost orchid. It was perfect. Delicate petals curved like a dancer in motion, its translucent bloom almost glowing in the shadowed forest. I dropped to my knees, fumbling for my camera, but as I reached out to touch it, the air around me grew icy. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "Dad?" Sophia's voice trembled. "What's wrong?" I don't know," I said, pulling my hand back. The silence deepened, pressing in on us like a physical weight. Even Sophia stopped shuffling, her breath shallow. I took the picture quickly and marked the location. "Let's keep moving." That night, the forest came alive. I woke to the sound of rustling outside the RV. For a moment, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. A deliberate, rhythmic shuffling, like something dragging across the ground. Sophia stirred in her bunk, mumbling in her sleep. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside, the beam slicing through the darkness. The clearing was empty, the trees swaying faintly in the night breeze. But the ground near the edge of the woods was disturbed, deep gouges in the dirt as if something had been digging. "Dad?" Sophia's voice startled me. I turned to see her standing in the doorway, clutching her blanket. "What are you doing?" "Nothing," I said quickly. "Go back inside." She didn't move. "Something's out there, isn't it?" I didn't answer, and that silence was enough for her to dart back into the RV. I followed, locking the door behind us. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, we found the trail markers moved. Every strip of orange fabric, every arrow scratched into the dirt. They were all in the wrong places, pointing us in circles. At first, I thought I'd made a mistake, but as we retraced our steps, the truth became clear. "Someone's messing with us," I muttered, my fists clenching. "Or something," Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stuck close to my side, her usual curiosity replaced with wide-eyed fear. I tried to reassure her, but my confidence was slipping. The forest felt alive in a way I couldn't explain, the air charged with a quiet malice. And then we saw it. A figure stood among the trees, barely visible through the foliage. It was humanoid, but impossibly tall, its body covered in moss and vines that seemed to writhe and shift. Its eyes glowed faintly green, locking on to me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. "Dad," Sophia whispered, clutching my arm. "What is that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move, but the forest around it seemed to darken, the trees leaning inward. I backed away slowly, pulling Sophia with me, and the figure melted into the shadows. By the time we reached the RV, the air was thick with tension. I packed our gear quickly, my hands trembling as I stuffed supplies into the cabinets. Sophia sat by the window, watching the tree line. "Do you think it'll come here?" she asked. "I don't know," I said, "but we're leaving. Now." I turned the key in the ignition, but the engine sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. The battery, which had been fine the day before, was completely drained. "Of course," I muttered, slamming my hand against the wheel. Sophia started to cry, and I knelt beside her, forcing myself to stay calm. "Hey, it's going to be okay. We'll figure this out." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. That night, the figure returned. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes fixed on the RV. I could feel its gaze through the walls, a suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe. Sophia clung to me, her small frame trembling. "What does it want?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, but deep down I thought I did. It wanted the orchid. I reached into my pack, pulling out the specimen I'd collected. The moment it touched my hand, the air inside the RV grew colder, and the walls seemed to groan under an invisible weight. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. My instincts screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. "Dad, stop," Sophia said, her voice breaking. "Please, just leave it." I looked at her, then at the orchid. It had been everything I'd worked for, a symbol of my love for Laura and the life we'd built. But it wasn't worth this. It wasn't worth her. With shaking hands, I stepped outside and laid the orchid on the ground. The figure paused, its head tilting as if studying me. Then, without a sound, it reached down, vines curling around the flower, and disappeared into the forest. The next morning, the RV started without issue. The trail markers were back in place, and the forest seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Sophia and I didn't speak much as we packed up and drove away. As we reached the edge of the park, I noticed something on the dashboard. A single bud of the ghost orchid, its petals pristine. I didn't touch it. Some things, I realized, were meant to stay where they belonged. The forest felt different this time. It had been 3 years since I'd been to Shawnee National Forest. The last time was with Laura. We'd taken this exact route, parked in the same secluded spot, and hiked the same trails. It had been her idea, a trip to reconnect after months of us drifting apart. But instead of bringing us closer, the trip ended in tragedy. And now I was back, trying to make sense of it all, trying to say goodbye. The RV rumbled to a stop near Ash Hollow, a place she'd loved. It was a narrow clearing surrounded by towering oaks, their bare branches tangled against the gray sky. I killed the engine and stepped out, the air cool and damp. My boots crunched on the gravel as I walked to the back of the RV and began unpacking. The silence here was heavy, pressing, like the forest was holding its breath. I had come for closure. Or maybe punishment. I wasn't sure which. The first day passed quietly. I hiked one of the shorter trails, the same one we'd taken that morning 3 years ago. The trees had grown denser, the paths narrower, but I remembered every turn, every rock outcropping. I couldn't stop thinking about her, how she'd laughed as she raced ahead, teasing me for being too slow, how she'd paused to take pictures of everything, her camera always slung around her neck. I could almost hear her voice echoing through the trees. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was setting. The shadows stretched long and jagged across the clearing, and the air felt colder than it should. I made a small fire and sat in silence, staring at the flames. That's when I heard it. A laugh, faint and melodic, drifting from the direction of the hollow. My breath caught. It was her laugh, soft, familiar, unmistakable. I stood, scanning the trees, but there was no one there. "Laura?" My voice sounded small against the forest's weight. The laugh came again, this time farther away. I took a step toward it before catching myself. My pulse hammered in my ears. "It's just the wind," I muttered, forcing myself to sit back down. But I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I could hear her calling my name. The next morning, I found her scarf. It was draped over a low-hanging branch near the edge of the clearing, its blue fabric fluttering faintly in the breeze. My heart stopped. She'd been wearing it the day she died. I'd seen it fall into the river as the current swept her away. I approached it cautiously, as if it might vanish if I got too close. My fingers brushed the fabric, and I recoiled. It was wet, cold, as if it had just been pulled from the water. "This isn't possible," I whispered. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. I hadn't brought the scarf. I hadn't brought anything of hers. The air around me seemed to thicken, and I felt the weight of eyes on my back. Slowly, I turned, but the forest was empty. Still, the feeling didn't leave me. That afternoon, I decided to hike deeper into the hollow. I told myself it was to clear my head, but part of me hoped I'd find something. An answer, a sign, anything to explain what was happening. The forest grew darker as I went, the trees pressing closer together, their branches clawing at the sky. The silence was suffocating. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the trail. As I rounded a bend, I saw it. The picnic blanket. It was spread out neatly on the ground, exactly as it had been that day. The same faded red and white checkered pattern, the same folds. My legs felt like lead as I approached it. There was even a thermos sitting in the center, just like before. "Laura," I said aloud, my voice trembling. "Are you here?" The forest didn't answer, but as I bent to pick up the blanket, a gust of wind tore through the hollow, carrying with it a faint whisper, "Mark." I spun around, but there was no one there. The trees loomed silently, their branches swaying as if in mockery. My heart pounded as I stuffed the blanket into my pack and hurried back toward the RV. That night, the dreams came. I was back on the riverbank, the water rushing loudly around me. Laura was there, standing on a jagged rock in the center of the current. She was smiling, her arms outstretched. "Come on, Mark," she called. "It's not that far." But as I stepped toward her, the rock crumbled and she fell, her scream cutting through the roar of the river. I reached out, but she was gone, swallowed by the current. Her scarf floated to the surface, bobbing once before disappearing. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The RV was pitch black and the air felt icy. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, but my hand froze when I heard it. "Mark?" The voice was faint, coming from just outside the RV. My throat tightened as I sat up, straining to listen. The voice came again, closer this time, followed by a soft tappings on the window. I didn't move. My mind screamed at me to stay put, to ignore it, but my body betrayed me. I crept to the window and pulled the curtain aside. She was standing in the clearing, her figure bathed in pale moonlight. Her hair was damp, her clothes clinging to her like she'd just stepped out of the river. But her face? It wasn't right. Her eyes were hollow, and her lips twisted into a too-wide smile. "Come with me," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "It's not that far." I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. When I looked again, she was gone. The clearing was empty, but her voice lingered, whispering my name over and over. I didn't sleep after that. Instead, I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel, waiting for dawn. When the first light crept over the horizon, I started the RV and drove as far as I could without looking back. But the forest wouldn't let me go. The road twisted and turned, the trees blurring together in a gray-green haze. I should have reached the main highway within an hour, but the road kept looping back on itself, bringing me to the same clearing over and over again. By the third time, I was ready to scream. "This isn't real," I muttered, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. "It's just in my head." But the forest seemed to disagree. The air grew heavier, the shadows deeper, until I could barely see the road in front of me. And then, as I rounded another bend, the engine sputtered and died. I sat there in silence, the weight of the forest pressing down on me. Then, in the distance, I heard it. Her laugh, soft and inviting, drawing me back toward the hollow. I don't remember walking back to the clearing. One moment I was in the RV, and the next I was standing at the edge of the river. The scarf was there again, tangled in the roots of a tree, and beyond it, her figure stood in the water, waiting. "Mark," she said, her voice sweet and full of longing. "You've been running for so long. Don't you miss me?" Tears blurred my vision. "I do," I whispered, "every day." "Then come with me," she said, holding out her hand. "We can be together again." I took a step forward, the water lapping at my boots, but as I reached for her, something shifted. Her smile faded, and her eyes turned cold. "You let me die," she hissed, her voice distorting. "You didn't save me." The water around her began to churn, and her figure twisted, becoming something darker, something hollow. The scarf unraveled, its fabric bleeding into the water like ink. "No," I shouted, stumbling back. "It wasn't my fault." The shadows surged toward me, but I stood my ground, my fists clenched. "It wasn't my fault," I repeated, the words echoing through the hollow. "I tried to save you. I did everything I could." For a moment, the forest was silent. Then the shadows began to recede, the water stilling. Her figure faded, her voice whispering one last time. "It's not that far." I woke up in the RV, the engine purring softly, the road ahead clear. The forest was still, the hollow behind me fading into the distance. I don't know if I'll ever come back to Shawnee. But as I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her standing at the edge of the trees, her smile gentle this time, before she disappeared into the mist. The desert has a way of swallowing sound. At first, it feels peaceful, like you're wrapped in silence. But after a while, it becomes oppressive, the stillness amplifying every step, every breath. That's what I noticed most when I first arrived in Big Bend. It wasn't just quiet, it was hungry. I pulled my RV into a gravel turnout at the edge of the park, the jagged Chisos Mountains looming in the distance. My plan was simple: camp for a week, find inspiration, and write the song that would save my career. After months of dead-end gigs and my band walking out on me, I needed something, anything, to reignite the spark. But this wasn't just about music. My grandfather used to tell stories about Big Bend, about a melody that could inspire greatness or destroy you. He called it the Devil's Song. I never believed him, but now, desperate and empty, I thought, what if? The first night, the desert stretched out around me, a blanket of stars overhead. I sat by the fire with my guitar, strumming aimlessly. No riffs came, no lyrics, just dead air. Frustrated, I put the guitar aside and leaned back, letting the silence fill my ears. That's when I heard it. A melody, faint and distant, carried on the wind. It was haunting, beautiful, a mix of strings and something else, something I couldn't identify. I stood, straining to hear. It came from somewhere beyond the hills, fading in and out like a whisper. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice swallowed by the dark. There was no answer, just the melody, drifting further away. I should have let it go, but I didn't. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound into the desert. The melody led me up a narrow trail, the beam of my flashlight barely cutting through the shadows. The desert at night is different, alive in ways you can't explain. Every crunch of gravel beneath my boots felt too loud, like it was echoing off unseen walls. Then the melody stopped. I froze, scanning the area with my light. There was no one, no instruments, just the wind brushing through the mesquite. My pulse quickened. I was about to turn back when I heard it again, closer this time. A guitar, softly strumming, accompanied by a faint hum. I followed the sound to a ridge overlooking a dry riverbed. Below, the pale moonlight illuminated something strange, an abandoned town. Roofless buildings sagged under the weight of years, and a single church steeple jutted against the sky like a warning finger. The melody was louder now, coming from the heart of the ruins. The town was eerily preserved, as if the desert had decided to keep its secrets intact. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing off cracked adobe walls. The melody danced on the wind, always just ahead, luring me deeper. I stopped in front of a crumbling building, what might have been a saloon. Inside, the walls were covered in murals, faded but vivid. Musicians stood in unnatural poses, their faces obscured by shadow. Around them, shadowy figures crowded, their forms blending into the background. The instruments and the paintings seemed almost alive, gleaming strings, polished brass, and drums taut with invisible energy. My stomach twisted. The longer I stared, the more the figures seemed to shift, their shadows creeping closer. A sharp gust of wind brought me back to my senses. I stumbled out, the melody pulling me further into the town. I followed the sound to a makeshift amphitheater carved into the rock. The benches were empty, but I could feel something, a presence. The melody swirled through the air, growing more complex, more intoxicating. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the center of the amphitheater. And then I saw them. Figures materialized out of the darkness, shadowy but distinct. They sat on the benches, motionless, their faces turned toward the empty stage. There were dozens of them, maybe more, a silent audience waiting for a performance. I felt their eyes, or what should have been eyes, turned toward me. The music swelled, and for a moment I felt something stir inside me. My fingers itched to play, my mind filling with notes and rhythms I'd never imagined. "No," I whispered, stepping back. The shadows didn't move, but I felt their attention pressing on me, heavy and suffocating. I turned and ran. I didn't get far. The music grew louder, a crescendo that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I stumbled, falling to my knees as the air around me warped. The amphitheater was gone, replaced by a vast, empty plain. And there they were. The band stood before me, ghostly figures glowing faintly in the dark. There were 5 of them. 2 guitarists, a violinist, a drummer, and a singer whose voice dripped with honey and fire. Their instruments gleamed as if freshly polished, the music flowing from them like a living thing. "Ryan Mendoza," the singer said, her voice as smooth as silk. "We've been waiting for you." I tried to speak, but no words came. The melody pulled at me, promising inspiration, success, everything I'd ever wanted. "You've lost your way," she continued, stepping closer. "But we can help you. Join us, and the music will never leave you again." Their words wrapped around me like a spell. I could feel the promise of their music, the fire it would bring to my fingertips, the songs that would make the world remember my name. For a moment, I reached out, my hand trembling, but then I remembered my grandfather's warning. He'd said the Devil's Song could inspire greatness, but it always came with a cost. I looked at the band, at the shadows curling around their feet, and I saw the truth. They weren't offering inspiration, they were offering chains. "No," I said, my voice hoarse. "I don't need you." The music faltered, the band recoiling as if struck. The singer's eyes burned with anger. "You can't resist us forever," she said. "The music is already inside you." I reached for the guitar strapped to my back, my fingers trembling as I plucked the strings. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I played the first melody that came to mind, a simple tune my grandfather used to hum, full of warmth and memory. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering. The band's music grew dissonant, clashing against my own. I played louder, pouring everything into the song, each note a reminder of who I was. The singer screamed, her voice twisted into something inhuman. The band dissolved into mist, their instruments fading into the night. The shadowy audience disappeared, leaving me alone beneath the stars. The amphitheater reappeared, empty and silent. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled back toward the RV, the desert stretching endlessly around me. When I finally reached it, I collapsed inside, locking the door behind me. The melody still echoed faintly in my mind, but it no longer held power over me. It was just a song now, a memory of what I'd left behind. Back in the city, the experience haunted me. I couldn't stop hearing the melody, couldn't stop thinking about the band. But instead of fear, it brought inspiration. I wrote a song about the desert, about the beauty and danger of chasing greatness. It became my most successful piece, the one that finally put my name on the map. But sometimes, when I play it, I feel them. The band, watching from the shadows, waiting for me to slip. And I wonder if I truly escaped, or if they let me go. Carlsbad Caverns had always called to me. Not the kind of call that comes in dreams or whispers, but the persistent pull of unfinished business. My mentor, Tom, left behind an incomplete map of these caves, his obsession cut short by a fall that buried him beneath rock and earth 5 years ago. Ever since, I'd felt the weight of his work and his memory pressing on my shoulders. Now, standing at the mouth of the caverns, I stared into the darkness. The park's official paths were well lit and safe, but the uncharted sections, the deep, twisting veins Tom had started exploring, were different. I'd come to finish his map. I told myself it was for him, but deep down, I knew it was for me. I parked my RV in the small lot near the cavern entrance, its silver frame reflecting the harsh desert sun. Inside, I double-checked my gear: headlamp, rope, food, water, oxygen meter, and Tom's old, weathered map. I wasn't a rookie at this, but the sense of unease gnawed at me. Maybe it was the stillness, the way the desert air seemed too thick, too quiet. As I descended into the main cavern, the temperature dropped and the air grew damp. The echo of my boots against the stone walls reverberated unnaturally, a reminder of how small I was in this massive, ancient place. The park's guide ropes and lights ended after a few minutes. Beyond them lay the wild, uncharted caverns Tom had once called the heart of the earth. I clicked on my headlamp and crossed the boundary. The first few hours were uneventful, though the caverns were breathtaking. Stalactites hung like chandeliers, glinting faintly in the dim light. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath my boots and the occasional drip of water. But then I started hearing the whispers. At first, I thought it was wind moving through the tunnels, but the air was too still and the sounds too rhythmic. Soft, murmuring voices that seemed to echo from every direction. I paused, sweeping my headlamp across the walls, but saw nothing. "Just your imagination," I muttered, shaking my head. Still, the whispers lingered, faint but insistent, following me as I moved deeper into the labyrinth. Hours later, I came across the first carvings. They were faint, almost worn smooth by time, but unmistakable. Spirals, handprints, and humanoid shapes with elongated limbs. They reminded me of petroglyphs I'd seen in the Southwest, though these were cruder, more primitive. I traced one with my fingers, the grooves cool beneath my touch. Tom hadn't mentioned these in his notes. If he'd seen them, he'd kept them to himself. A shiver crawled up my spine, and I continued deeper, my curiosity outweighing my unease. By the time I stopped to rest, the whispers had grown louder, though still unintelligible. I sat on a flat rock, sipping water and checking Tom's map. It marked a large chamber ahead, one he'd called the Cathedral. If I could find it, I'd be one step closer to completing his work. But when I reached for my compass, it was gone. So was my knife. I'd had them both clipped to my belt minutes ago, but now they were nowhere to be found. Panic flickered at the edges of my mind. Had I dropped them? I retraced my steps, but found nothing. The caverns felt darker now, the walls closing in as if they'd shifted while my back was turned. I pressed on, my headlamp casting long, flickering shadows. The path narrowed into a tight passage, forcing me to crawl on my hands and knees. The air was stale, the whispers louder now, almost like breathing. When I emerged on the other side, the cavern was wrong. The landmarks I'd marked on Tom's map were missing, replaced by jagged formations I didn't recognize. It was as if the caves had rearranged themselves, the passages bending and twisting into an alien labyrinth. My heart raced as I checked my GPS. It flickered, the signal cutting in and out before disappearing entirely. I was on my own. As I wandered, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned, and for a split second, I saw him. Tom. He stood at the edge of my headlamp's beam, his familiar figure silhouetted against the stone. He didn't move, didn't speak. "Tom?" My voice cracked, echoing into the cavern. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. I chased after him, my boots slipping on the uneven ground. But when I reached the spot where he'd stood, there was nothing. Just silence and the faint smell of earth. The whispers grew louder. I stumbled into a vast chamber, my breath catching at the sight. The walls were covered in carvings, far more elaborate than the ones I'd seen before. Spirals, intricate patterns, and dozens of humanoid shapes stared back at me, their elongated limbs etched with precision. At the center of the chamber, a pool of black water reflected my headlamp's glow. Then I saw them. They emerged from the shadows one by one, humanoid, but not human. Their limbs were too long, their movements insect-like with clicking mandibles and glowing multifaceted eyes. They made no sound, but their presence was suffocating, their gaze heavy and ancient. I froze, my mind racing. They didn't attack, didn't move closer. They just watched, their unblinking eyes fixed on me. I tried to back away, but the cavern felt alive, the walls closing in, the air thick with tension. The whispers reached a crescendo, a symphony of disjointed voices that seemed to come from within my own head. "Leave," the voices hissed, overlapping and chaotic. I fumbled for my map, clutching it like a lifeline. Tom's work, the reason I'd come here. But as I stared at the crumpled paper, something clicked. This wasn't about finishing his map. This was about me. My need to prove myself, my inability to let go. The ant people shifted, their bodies blending with the shadows. They didn't want the map. They wanted me to understand. With shaking hands, I placed the map on the ground, smoothing it flat against the stone. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "This is yours." The whispers stopped. The chamber fell silent. The ant people retreated into the darkness, their glowing eyes fading one by one. The air lightened, the oppressive weight lifting from my chest. A faint breeze brushed past me, guiding me back the way I'd come. I followed it, my steps quick but careful. The cavern seemed to open up, the passages aligning as if showing me the way. When I finally saw the faint light of the surface, tears stung my eyes. I emerged into the warm desert air, collapsing beside the entrance. The sun was setting, casting the landscape in hues of orange and red. I looked back at the cavern mouth, half expecting to see glowing eyes watching me, but there was nothing, just stillness. Back at the RV, I unpacked my gear, my hands still trembling. As I reached for my notebook, I saw it, a new carving etched into the wall of the cavern entrance. It was one of the spirals, its lines sharp and deliberate. A reminder. I never finished Tom's map. Some places, I realized, aren't meant to be explored. But I kept the spiral etched into my memory, a symbol of what I'd learned in the dark. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see them again. The ant people, watching, waiting. The heart of the earth doesn't let go easily. The first thing you notice about Blackwater River State Forest is the quiet. Not the pleasant kind that feels peaceful, but the kind that makes you question whether you're really alone. That's why I came here, to get away, to push my custom RV to its limits and prove I could rely on my own craftsmanship. It was a way to focus, to bury everything else I didn't want to think about. The RV had been my project for years, a beast of a vehicle outfitted for off-grid living. Everything from the solar panels to the engine rebuild was my work. After Jenna left, it became an obsession. I told myself this trip would test its capabilities. Deep down, I knew it was about proving I was good at something, that I could build something perfect, even if I couldn't hold my life together. The first night, I parked the RV in a remote clearing just off one of Blackwater's dirt trails. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, pine trees towering like sentinels. The sun was low, painting everything in muted orange. The first night was fine, mostly. After dinner, I checked the systems. Batteries were holding steady, the water pump was working, and the engine purred when I gave it a test start. Everything was going smoothly until I went to bed. I woke around 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps. Not animals. These were heavy and deliberate, circling the RV in slow, uneven strides. I froze, straining to hear through the walls. My first thought was a hiker, but it didn't make sense. Who would be out here at this hour? The footsteps stopped. Then, faintly, I heard a single tap on the RV's back window. Just one. I waited, my pulse hammering, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was my imagination and fell into a restless sleep. The figures in the trees. The next morning, the incident felt like a bad dream. I distracted myself by hiking, mapping trails, and testing the RV's GPS system. The forest was beautiful in its own way, dense and green, with sunlight filtering through the canopy. I was starting to feel like myself again. Until I saw the figures. At first, I thought they were shadows. I was standing at the edge of a creek, watching the water ripple, when I noticed movement among the trees. Two figures stood about 50 yards away, partially hidden by the underbrush. They didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there. "Hey!" I called, my voice cutting through the quiet. No response. I stepped toward them, my boots crunching against the dirt. But when I got closer, they were gone, as if they'd melted into the forest. The underbrush wasn't even disturbed. I spent the rest of the hike glancing over my shoulder. The carvings. That evening, I decided to stay near the RV. Something about the figures unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I set up a fire pit and cooked dinner outside, the flickering flames keeping the encroaching darkness at bay. After eating, I wandered a bit around the campsite, scanning the trees for wildlife. That's when I noticed the carvings. They were etched into the trunks of 3 nearby pines. Faces, or at least the suggestion of faces. Each one was scratched away, leaving blank ovals where eyes, noses, and mouths should have been. The lines were jagged, like they'd been made in a hurry. A chill ran down my spine. I went back to the RV and locked the door. The missing time. That night, the RV betrayed me. I woke to find the lights flickering, the hum of the generator cutting in and out. I grabbed a flashlight and checked the electrical panel, but nothing seemed wrong. Just as I closed the panel, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the RV. I held my breath, listening as they stopped by the door. My hand reached for the wrench I'd left on the counter. Then I woke up. I was outside, lying in the dirt. My flashlight was gone, my boots caked in mud. The RV stood a few yards away, its door wide open. The sky was still dark, stars glittering faintly above. I stumbled to my feet, heart pounding, and checked my watch. It was 4:15 a.m. The last thing I remembered was standing inside the RV holding that wrench. I ran inside, locked the door, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The faceless ones close in. The next day I decided to leave. Whatever was happening here wasn't worth proving a point. But when I tried starting the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I checked everything, fuel lines, battery connections, even the spark plugs. Everything was fine, but it wouldn't start. It was as if the forest wanted me to stay. That night, they came back. I was sitting in the driver's seat, staring at the dashboard when I noticed the windows fogging up. It wasn't cold outside, but the condensation crept across the glass, obscuring the view. Then, one by one, handprints appeared. Long, slender fingers pressed against the glass, smearing the fog in deliberate patterns. I grabbed my wrench and flashlight, trembling as I scanned the darkness outside. The handprints vanished as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving the windows clear again. But then I saw them. The figures, standing just beyond the firelight. They were closer now, no longer hiding among the trees. I counted 5, tall, pale, and featureless, their faces blank ovals like the carvings on the trees. "Go away!" I shouted, raising the flashlight like a weapon. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, staring without eyes, their silence more terrifying than any sound. The confrontation. I retreated inside, slamming the door and locking it. My hands shook as I scrambled to find something, anything that might protect me. A canister of lighter fluid sat near the stove, and an idea sparked in my mind. I grabbed the fluid, doused a nearby log, and set it ablaze outside the RV. The fire roared, casting flickering light across the clearing. The figures retreated slightly, their forms rippling like heat waves, but they didn't leave. That's when I remembered the carvings, the faces, or lack of them. The forest had tried to erase them, just like it was trying to erase me. I needed to reclaim something of myself. Grabbing my pocket knife, I stepped out of the RV and approached the nearest tree. The figures loomed at the edge of the clearing, but they didn't stop me. With trembling hands, I carved my name into the bark, Ethan. The figures froze, their heads tilting in unison. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the air thick and heavy. Then, one by one, they dissolved into the shadows, their forms fading like smoke. Escape. The RV started on the first try the next morning. I didn't waste time. I packed up, turned the ignition, and drove away without looking back. The forest stretched endlessly on either side of the dirt road, but it felt lighter now, less oppressive. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I left Blackwater behind, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A single figure stood at the edge of the trees, its blank face turned toward me. I don't know what it wanted, and I don't want to know. Ending. The RV runs perfectly now, every system flawless. But sometimes, when I park it in a quiet spot, I find handprints on the windows. Long, slender fingers that vanish when I look too closely. The faceless ones haven't forgotten me, and I don't think they ever will. I had read about Dry Creek Canyon in one of those clickbait articles. Top 10 most haunted places you've never heard of. It described eerie, disembodied screams echoing through the cliffs at night, driving campers away in terror. The locals whispered about a vengeful spirit, a skin screamer, but no one had ever explained what it really was or if it was real. That's why I was here, in the middle of the desert, with my RV and a trunk full of equipment. I wanted to prove there was no such thing as ghosts. As a documentary filmmaker, I'd made a career out of debunking haunted places. It wasn't about disproving people's beliefs. It was about peeling back the layers of superstition to reveal the truth. There was always an explanation: wind, echoes, animals. Dry Creek Canyon would be no different. I arrived late in the afternoon, the desert heat beating down on the RV as I pulled into a primitive campsite near the dried riverbed. The canyon's jagged cliffs loomed over me, their rust-red walls streaked with the shadows of late-day sunlight. The silence was unnerving. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of gravel under my boots as I stepped outside. The place was stunning in its desolation. The cliffs towered above like ancient sentinels, and the sky stretched endlessly, painted with the faint hues of twilight. But there was something off, a weight in the air. I chalked it up to my overactive imagination and got to work setting up my cameras and audio equipment. The first night, the screams came. It started around midnight as I sat inside the RV reviewing the footage I'd captured earlier. The sound was faint at first, a high-pitched wail that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. I froze, straining to listen. It came again, louder this time, echoing off the canyon walls. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cold, much colder than it had been earlier, and the light from the RV cast long, eerie shadows across the dirt. The scream came again, from somewhere deep within the canyon. It was raw, agonized, like someone being torn apart. I told myself it was just an animal, a coyote, maybe, or a mountain lion. But there was something human about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I stayed outside for a while, scanning the cliffs with my flashlight, but the sound didn't come again. The next day, I explored the canyon. The air was dry and sharp as I hiked along the dried riverbed, my boots crunching against the cracked earth. The cliffs seemed to close in around me, their jagged edges slicing into the sky. I followed the sound of the wind, letting it guide me toward the source of the screams. That's when I found the caves. Carved into the canyon walls, the entrances were dark and foreboding, their edges smooth and weathered by time. One cave in particular caught my attention. Its entrance was surrounded by strange carvings, interlocking patterns that twisted and coiled like vines. As I stepped closer, the air grew colder, and I felt a strange pull, as if the cave were beckoning me inside. I didn't go in, not yet. Instead, I marked the location on my map and headed back to camp. I told myself I needed more time to prepare. The truth was, I was scared. That night, the screams came back. They were louder this time, more insistent, and they seemed to come from all directions. I stepped outside, my camera rolling, trying to pinpoint their source. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, raw, guttural, and filled with a rage that seemed almost sentient. As I stood there, the wind picked up, swirling dust around me. Shadows danced across the cliffs, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a tall, skeletal figure standing at the edge of my light. I swung the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. Back in the RV, I reviewed the footage. My hands trembled as I watched the video, frame by frame. At the edge of the screen, just for a second, there was a shape. A figure, gaunt and translucent, its face stretched into a perpetual scream. The following morning, I decided to confront the caves. Armed with my flashlight, camera, and a sturdy walking stick, I made my way back to the marked cave. The carvings seemed to glow faintly in the morning light, their twisting patterns almost hypnotic. As I stepped inside, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around me. The cave was deeper than I'd expected, its floor sloping downward into darkness. The light from my flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. And then I saw it. A campsite. It was old, the remains of a fire pit surrounded by tattered sleeping bags and rusted cans. But there was something else. A pile of bones, human bones, scattered across the ground. My stomach turned as I stepped closer, my flashlight revealing a skull half buried in the dirt. The screams started again, louder than ever, reverberating through the cave like a living thing. My head throbbed with the sound as I stumbled backward, my camera capturing the chaos. The light flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw movement. Shadows shifting at the edges of my vision. I ran. The final night was the worst. I barely slept, my mind replaying the images from the cave over and over. The bones, the carvings, the figure on the cliffs. It didn't make sense, none of it. And yet, I couldn't deny what I'd seen. Something was out there, something that defied explanation. Around midnight, the screams started again, but this time they were different. They weren't coming from the canyon, they were coming from the RV. I froze as the sound echoed through the small space, raw and guttural. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move, shifting and writhing like they were alive. The air grew colder, and a low, guttural voice whispered my name. Nate. I turned, and there it was. The figure stood in the corner of the RV, its gaunt form shimmering like smoke. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth was stretched wide, emitting an endless, silent scream. My chest tightened as it stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. I grabbed my camera and snapped a photo, the flash blinding in the darkness. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I bolted out of the RV and into the night. I drove out of the canyon at dawn, my heart racing as the screams faded into the distance. The road twisted and turned, the cliffs closing in around me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the highway, the desert stretched out before me, empty and silent. I pulled over and sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the wheel, my mind replaying everything I'd seen and heard. The footage from my camera was corrupted, the images distorted and filled with static. But one frame remained intact, a single photo of the figure in the RV, its hollow eyes staring back at me. Even now, weeks later, I can still hear the screams. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up to the sound of my own voice echoing through the dark. When I first pulled my RV into the dusty clearing near the Chisos Mountains, I told myself this trip was just about the landscapes. That's what I wrote in my journal anyway, forcing the pen to press the lie into paper. But I wasn't here for the sweeping desert views or the crimson cliffs that glowed like fire at sunset. I was here because I couldn't keep running. Not from Danny, and not from the memories of the fire. The desert had a way of stripping you down, leaving nothing but the bare essentials of who you were. It was harsh, merciless, and deeply quiet. At night, the temperature dropped so low I could see my breath inside the RV, and by day, the sun scorched everything it touched. I had parked at the edge of a trail leading toward the Whispering Stone, a rock formation I'd read about in an old ranger's journal. Local legends said it was cursed, that you could hear the voices of the dead if you got close enough. Most people dismissed it as folklore, but I wasn't so sure. The first day, I hiked through the barren landscape, my boots crunching over dry earth. The stone loomed in the distance, its jagged silhouette rising like a beacon. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to hum, like an unseen current running just beneath the surface. Then I heard the voice. It was faint, carried on the wind. At first I thought it was the sound of the breeze cutting through the canyons, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Jack?" I froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was Danny. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the empty desert. Nothing but red rock and brittle brush as far as the eye could see. My pulse quickened. "Danny!" I called, my voice cracking. No response, just the wind hissing through the scrub. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the acoustics. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was sinking low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I locked the door, double-checking it before sitting at the tiny table with my journal. The words didn't come easily. Every time I started to write about what I'd heard, the pen hovered over the page, refusing to move. I ended up sketching the Whispering Stone instead, its sharp edges and towering height etched in shaky lines. That night, I dreamed of fire. I woke up gasping, the smell of smoke still vivid in my nose. My heart pounded as I fumbled for the lantern on the counter, lighting it with shaking hands. The RV was silent, but the dream lingered, vivid and raw. Danny had been there, standing in the middle of the inferno, his face streaked with soot. He'd looked at me with those accusing eyes, the same look he'd given me the day we lost him. "You didn't pull me out," he'd said. "You left me." The next morning, I decided to hike back to the stone. The air felt heavier this time, like the desert itself was holding its breath. My water purifier had stopped working overnight, forcing me to ration the bottles I'd packed. As I climbed closer to the stone, my compass began to spin, the needle dancing erratically. The hum I'd noticed the day before was louder now, vibrating in my chest. And then I saw them. Footprints. They were large, barefoot and human-like, but wrong. The toes were long and clawed, pressed deep into the sand. They led straight toward the stone. By midday, the sun was at its peak, beating down mercilessly. Sweat trickled down my neck as I stood at the base of the Whispering Stone, craning my neck to look up at its jagged form. The whispers started again, louder this time. "Jack!" I stumbled back, scanning the area. There was no one else here, just me and the wind. But the voices wouldn't stop. They overlapped, forming a chorus of pleas and accusations. "You left us. Why didn't you save me?" "Jack?" I clamped my hands over my ears, but the voices seemed to come from inside my head, drilling into my skull. When I returned to the RV, the sun was already setting. I hadn't realized how long I'd been out there. My legs ached and my head pounded with dehydration, but I forced myself to drink sparingly, knowing I couldn't afford to run out of water. That night, the RV's generator sputtered and died. I lit a lantern and tried to write in my journal, but the whispers outside wouldn't let me concentrate. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the sound of the wind. But as the hours dragged on, they grew louder, until it felt like they were just outside the door. And then came the knocking. It was soft at first, a tentative tap, tap, tap against the metal. My throat tightened as I gripped the flashlight, aiming it at the door. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The knocking stopped. I held my breath, waiting, but no answer came. just the relentless whispering pressing against the walls like a tide. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, the footprints were back, circling the RV in the sand. The next day, I resolved to confront whatever was haunting me. I packed what little water I had left and headed back to the stone, determined to prove to myself that it was all in my head. The air felt electric, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. The whispers started as soon as I stepped onto the trail, rising and falling like a sinister chant. When I reached the stone, the world around me seemed to shift. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, twisting and contorting across the ground. And then I saw him. Danny. He stood at the base of the stone, his face pale and drawn, his firefighter's gear charred and blackened. "You left me," he said, his voice hollow. Tears stung my eyes as I stumbled toward him. "I tried. I swear I tried." He shook his head, his eyes filled with pain. "You didn't try hard enough." The ground beneath me began to shift, the sand swirling like a whirlpool. Danny's form flickered, breaking apart into shadow and smoke. "You don't deserve to be here," the voices said in unison. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head as the whispers grew deafening. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fought to stay grounded, to remind myself of what was real. "It wasn't my fault," I said through gritted teeth. "I did everything I could." The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering. The whispers faltered, replaced by a low, rumbling hum. I reached into my pack and pulled out the emergency flare I'd brought for signaling. With shaking hands, I struck it. The red flame burst into life in the darkness. The shadows screamed, their forms writhing and collapsing as the light washed over them. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV. The next thing I knew, I was slumped in the driver's seat, the flare still clutched in my hand. The desert outside was quiet, the whispering stone fading into the distance as I drove away. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I opened my journal. For the first time, the words came easily. "I'm sorry, Danny. I'll carry you with me, but I can't keep carrying the guilt. It's time to let go." The desert had stripped me down to nothing, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could rebuild. Shallow Ridge wasn't on the map. Not really. Sure, you could find the name if you zoomed in close enough on GPS, but the little campground nestled in Wyoming's plains wasn't a place you'd stumble upon by accident. And that's exactly why I was here. I'd spent the better part of my career chasing the human stories behind forgotten places, trails worn smooth by pioneers, settlements reclaimed by time, and the occasional ghost story for flavor. Shallow Ridge had all three. The legend of the phantom caravan caught my attention the moment I read about it. A wagon train that disappeared in the 1800s, its settlers swallowed by the wilderness. Some claimed you could still see their ghostly lanterns flickering on the ridge, hear their voices in the wind. That's the kind of story you can't ignore. Or at least I couldn't. The campground was as lonely as I'd expected. The land stretched flat for miles, the horizon broken only by jagged outcrops of rock and the golden glow of dry prairie grass. The wind carried a hollow whistle, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the ridge. There was one other camper parked a few spots down, a battered old RV with its awning half rolled out. As I stepped out of my own rig to stretch my legs, a wiry man in his 60s emerged from the neighboring vehicle. He gave me a polite nod and I returned it. "Name's Howard," he said, leaning on the side of his RV. You here for the ridge?" I shrugged. "Something like that. You?" "Not anymore." His expression darkened. "Take my advice. Don't stay too long. Sun goes down. Things get strange out here." I chuckled, hoping it masked my unease. "I've heard the stories. Don't tell me you've seen the caravan." Howard didn't laugh. "You'll see it if you're not careful." I didn't ask what he meant. That night, I saw the campfire. The sun dipped below the horizon quickly, leaving the plains bathed in twilight. I sat by my RV, camera in hand, waiting for the stars to come out. The air was crisp, the wind quieter than I'd expected, peaceful. Then, out on the ridge, a faint glow caught my eye. It flickered, orange and warm, a campfire. My first thought was that someone else had arrived, but as I stared, I realized something was off. The fire wasn't steady. It wavered like a mirage, flickering in and out of sight. I grabbed my flashlight and hiked out to investigate. The ridge wasn't far, but the climb was steep, the rocks loose underfoot. When I reached the spot where I'd seen the fire, there was nothing there. No smoke, no embers, just a patch of flattened grass, cold and undisturbed. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint sound, a creak, like wagon wheels. The next morning, Howard was gone. His RV sat in the same spot, its door ajar. A camp chair rested near the fire pit, untouched. I knocked on the door, calling his name, but there was no answer. Inside, his belongings were in perfect order. Clothes folded on the bed, a coffee cup sitting in the sink. It was as if he'd stepped out for a moment and never come back. I told myself he'd probably left early, though I couldn't explain why his RV was still there. People do strange things, especially in places like this. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That afternoon, I hiked deeper into the ridge. The wind carried whispers now, faint and fleeting, like voices just out of earshot. I told myself it was the breeze moving through the rocks, but the sound made my skin prickle. About a mile from the campground, I found something strange. A trail of boot prints pressed into the dry earth. They were old, worn, and spaced as if someone had been walking slowly. The trail led toward the plateau, where it abruptly ended at the edge of a steep drop. No footprints turned back. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty horizon. That's when I heard it again. The creak of wagon wheels, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere in the distance. By the time the sun set, the ridge was alive. I stood outside my RV, the camera ready, as the darkness settled over the plains. The wind had died completely, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. Then, one by one, the lights appeared. Lanterns. At least half a dozen, bobbing gently along the horizon like fireflies. They moved slowly, following an invisible path, their warm glow flickering against the black sky. I raised my camera and snapped a photo, but when I looked back up, the lights were closer. Too close. They weren't lanterns, they were wagons. A ghostly caravan rolled across the ridge, its wheels silent, its figures cloaked in shadow. Horses, gaunt and skeletal, pulled the wagons forward, their heads low. The settlers themselves were little more than silhouettes, their faces blurred and indistinct. I froze, unable to look away as the procession moved past me, fading in and out like a flickering flame. One of the figures turned. Its hollow gaze met mine, and my breath caught in my throat. "Help us," it whispered. The caravan disappeared as suddenly as it had come, leaving me in silence. My hands trembled as I reviewed the photos on my camera. The images were there, blurry and distorted, but unmistakable. Wagons, horses, figures, real, or at least real enough. I should have left then, packed up and driven away, but something about the whisper stuck with me. Help us. What did they want? I spent hours poring over my notes, searching for answers. The settlers of Shallow Ridge had vanished without a trace, that much was true. Some said they'd gotten lost. Others believed they'd been attacked by bandits or driven mad by hunger. But there were no records, no graves. It was as if they'd simply walked off the map. The next day I hiked to the plateau. The terrain was harsh, the sun blazing overhead, but I pushed on, driven by a need I couldn't explain. The boot prints I'd found earlier reappeared, leading me to a dried-up creek bed at the edge of the ridge. That's where I saw it, a wagon wheel half buried in the dirt. Its wood was splintered, its spokes blackened as if by fire. Nearby I found more remnants, rusted tools, shards of pottery, a torn scrap of fabric. And then, carved into the rock, a single word: West. The air grew heavy, and a low hum filled my ears. I turned, and there they were. The caravan. The wagons were closer this time, their figures more distinct. The settlers' faces were pale and sunken, their eyes wide with desperation. They stood silently, their lanterns flickering, their mouths moving in whispers I couldn't understand. "Help us," one said again, louder this time. "Show us the way." I stumbled backward, heart pounding, but the figures didn't move. They simply stared, their hollow eyes pleading. "I don't know how," I said, my voice shaking. "I can't help you." The murmurs grew louder, overlapping into a deafening roar. The world around me flickered, the landscape warping like an old film reel breaking down. The settlers stepped closer, their forms wavering like smoke, and I felt a cold hand graze my arm. Desperate, I reached into my pack and pulled out an old map I'd found in town, a crude drawing of the pioneer trails. I held it up, shouting over the din. "Here," I yelled, "this is the way." The whispers stopped. The settlers froze, their forms flickering one last time before fading into the mist. The air grew still, the hum subsiding into silence. I didn't stop running until I reached my RV. The campground was empty. The prairie bathed in the soft glow of twilight. I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine roaring to life. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. On the ridge, faint and distant, the lantern still glowed. Weeks later, I reviewed the photos again. Most were corrupted, filled with static and blurred light. But one image remained intact, a single wagon, its lantern burning bright, with a shadowy figure at the reins. And in the corner of the frame, barely visible, was the word carved into the rock: West. I parked my RV in the shadow of the crimson cliffs, their jagged edges cutting into the blue sky like ancient scars. Red Hollow was exactly what I'd hoped for, desolate, rugged, and untouched by the modern world. The campsite was empty, save for me. Perfect. That was how I worked best, alone, surrounded by nothing but rock and silence. The locals in the nearby town had warned me. Something about the cliffs being cursed, about miners who vanished decades ago. They told me to stay away from the caves, to leave before nightfall. I smiled politely and nodded, but I didn't take them seriously. I was a geologist, not a ghost hunter. Stories like that didn't scare me. They intrigued me. I wasn't here for the legends, though. The sandstone formations of Red Hollow were unique, carved by centuries of wind and water into impossibly narrow slot canyons and steep cliffs. If the rumors of forgotten tunnels beneath the cliffs were true, they'd make for an incredible discovery. That was what I cared about. The first day, I explored the canyon. The dry desert air pressed against me as I made my way along the riverbed, its cracked surface a mosaic of reds and browns. My boots crunched against the rocks and the sun beat down on my shoulders. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. About a mile in, I found the markings. At first, they were faint, just scratches on the sandstone walls. But as I went deeper, they became more deliberate, forming strange, swirling patterns. I traced one with my fingers, feeling the grooves etched into the rock. It looked old, too old to be graffiti. As I stepped back, the air seemed to shift. The canyon grew quieter, the wind dying down. For the first time, I felt uneasy, like someone was watching me. That night, the whispers started. I was in the RV, reviewing the day's photos on my laptop when I heard it. Faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the generator. A low, murmuring sound, like voices carried on the wind. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, clearer this time, echoing off the canyon walls. I stepped outside, the flashlight heavy in my hand. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for the desert at night. I scanned the cliffs, the light cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. Just shadows dancing against the sandstone. And yet, the whispers continued. Faint, distorted, they almost sounded like my name. The next morning, I found the mine. I'd planned to return to the markings I'd found the day before, but the whispers nagged at me, pulling me deeper into the canyon. The air grew cooler as I followed a narrow path, the cliffs closing in around me. That's when I saw it, a dark opening in the rock, partially obscured by overgrowth, the mine entrance. I crouched in front of it, shining my flashlight inside. The air that came out was cold and damp, carrying a faint metallic smell. I hesitated. The stories from the town flashed through my mind, miners disappearing, bodies never found. But curiosity got the better of me. Inside, the walls were lined with timbers, their wood darkened with age. The floor sloped downward, the light from my flashlight bouncing off the damp rock. The whispers I'd heard the night before were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the dark. I didn't go far, just a few dozen feet, before I decided to turn back. Something about the place felt wrong, like it didn't want me there. That night, the shadows moved. I was sitting in the RV reading over my notes when I saw it, a flicker of movement at the edge of the window. I looked up, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the darkness outside. I told myself it was my imagination. I'd spent too much time in the sun, that was all. But then it happened again. This time I saw it clearly, a shadow, long and thin, darting across the campsite. My chest tightened as I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. The desert was silent. The air was cold, and the shadow was gone. But something else caught my attention. On the ground around the RV were markings, scratches in the dirt that formed the same swirling patterns I'd seen in the canyon. My throat went dry as I backed into the RV, locking the door behind me. The whispers came back, louder this time, closer. The next day I made a decision. I had to go back into the mine. I told myself it was for the research, that I couldn't leave without documenting what I'd found. But the truth was, I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening, why the shadows and whispers seemed to follow me. I packed my gear, flashlight, headlamp, mapping equipment, and set out. The canyon was eerily quiet, the cliffs towering over me like ancient sentinels. When I reached the mine, the air around it seemed heavier, colder. The entrance loomed before me, dark and foreboding. Inside, the air was damp, the walls slick with condensation. I followed the tunnel deeper this time, marking my path with chalk as I went. The light from my headlamp barely penetrated the darkness, and every sound, my footsteps, the scrape of my gear, echoed unnaturally. About 100 feet in, I found them. The bones. They were scattered across the floor, mixed with rusted tools and the remains of rotted timbers. A pickaxe leaned against the wall, its handle splintered and worn. My stomach churned as I stepped closer, my light revealing the hollow sockets of a skull half buried in the dirt. And then the whispers returned. At first, they were faint, coming from deeper in the tunnel. But as I stood there, frozen, they grew louder, overlapping and twisting into something guttural and inhuman. The air grew colder, and the shadows along the walls seemed to shift, moving independently of my light. My hands trembled as I reached for my camera, snapping photos despite the terror coursing through me. As the flash illuminated the tunnel, I saw them, the hollow men. They stood at the edge of the light, their forms flickering like smoke. Their limbs were long and thin, their eyes hollow and glowing faintly. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stared, their presence suffocating. Panic took over. I turned and ran, the whispers turning into guttural growls behind me. The tunnel seemed to twist and stretch, the walls closing in as the light from my headlamp flickered. When I burst out of the mine, the sun was setting, casting the canyon in an eerie red glow. My chest heaved as I stumbled back to the RV, the whispers still echoing in my ears. I didn't stop to pack. I didn't look back. I started the engine and drove, the cliffs looming over me as the shadows lengthened. The road twisted and turned, the desert stretching out before me in endless waves of red and gold. It wasn't until I reached the highway that I finally exhaled, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. Weeks later, I still can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. The whispers come at night, faint but insistent, and I avoid shadows, afraid of what I might see. The photos I took in the mine were corrupted, the images distorted and filled with static. All except one, a single frame of the hollow men, their glowing eyes staring back at me. I don't know what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to Red Hollow.